Some encounters change everything, and this one began with a dropped ice cream cone in a dark Manhattan alley. Grand Street was blocked off by fire trucks. Talia gripped Josie's hand and glanced at the alley to the right, the only shortcut home. Josie had been yawning nonstop, her eyelids drooping, her little feet stumbling with every step. Talia had no other choice. "We'll go this way, okay? Hold my hand tight." Josie held on obediently, her other hand clutching a half-eaten ice cream cone, her mouth humming a song she'd learned in class that day. One. She still didn't quite know all the words to. The alley stretched long and narrow ahead, lit only by the dim yellow glow spilling from the back door of a restaurant. Then Talia heard men's voices up ahead, not loud, but heavy, the kind people keep low because they don't want to be overheard. She stopped. Instinct pulled Josie closer against her side. About 10 meters ahead, a man in a dark suit stood facing two others. Behind him, a large man with a shaved head stood perfectly still, like a wall of concrete. One of the two men was pointing, his voice a sharp hiss through clenched teeth. Talia didn't need to hear the words to understand this was no ordinary conversation. She took a step back, ready to pull Josie and turn around, but it was too late. The ice cream cone slipped from Josie's fingers and hit the concrete. "Oh no, my ice cream!" The little girl's voice rang out crystal clear through the silent alley. Every head turned. One of the two men stepped straight toward Talia. "Who let you in here?" The man in the suit spoke. His voice wasn't loud, but it cut through everything around them like a blade across glass. "Don't touch her." The man stopped instantly. The suited man stepped forward, placing himself between Talia and danger, then turned to the shaved head man behind him. "Get them out." The large man appeared beside Talia, his voice low. "Follow me, now." Talia lifted Josie into her arms and followed. Josie wrapped her arms around her sister's neck, her cheek pressed against Talia's shoulder, her round eyes staring back toward the alley over her sister's shoulder. At the mouth of the alley, warm yellow streetlight washed over their faces. The shaved head man stopped and looked Talia straight in the eyes. "You didn't see anything tonight. Understood?" Talia nodded. The man turned and disappeared back into the darkness. Josie lifted her head and whispered in her sister's ear, "Sis, that man in the black coat had really sad eyes. Does he have any friends?" Talia couldn't answer. She held Josie tighter and walked faster toward home. She didn't know the man's name, didn't know who he was. She only knew that, tonight, in a dark Manhattan alley, a stranger had stepped between her and danger without a second thought. And the 6-year-old girl in her arms had seen something no one else in that alley noticed: the sadness in his eyes. This story began that night, but what happened next, no one could have seen coming. If this story touched your heart, hit like to show your support and share it with someone you love. Subscribe to our channel so you never miss what comes next. Talia laid Josie down on the bed, gently, as though she were setting down something that could break. The little girl had fallen asleep while still in her arms, her breathing even, her face pressed against Talia's shoulder, her hand still clutching the edge of Talia's shirt, refusing to let go. Talia sat on the edge of the bed, slowly loosened each tiny finger from the fabric, then pulled the blanket up over Josie's chest. The little girl turned once, her mouth moving faintly as if she were talking in her sleep, then grew quiet again. Talia sat there watching her for a few more seconds, waiting until she was certain Josie had sunk into deep sleep, and only then did she stand and step outside. The studio apartment was so small that from the bed, the kitchen was only 5 steps away. The furniture was old, everything carrying the marks of time, but it was clean. On the walls, everywhere, were Josie's drawings. Dozens of pictures made with colored crayons on white paper, some taped up, some clipped to the little clothesline Talia had stretched across the kitchen corner. They were all stick figures. Suns much too large, green trees, white clouds. Josie drew her world in her own way, and that world was always full of sunlight. Talia leaned her back against the refrigerator and sank down onto the kitchen floor. Her legs were tired, her back ached, but it wasn't her body that kept her from standing up right then. It was her mind. It dragged her back to the alley. That man's voice was still echoing in her head. Only 2 words, "Don't touch." It hadn't been a shout. It hadn't been a threat. It had only been an ordinary sentence. But the way everything around them stopped when he opened his mouth was anything but ordinary. The other man had been walking toward her, and those 2 words alone had made him freeze in place. Not because he was afraid of the sound, because he was afraid of the man who had made it. Talia wasn't the kind of person who was easily impressed. She'd lived long enough in this city to know when to walk faster, when to look down, when to pretend she hadn't seen anything. But tonight was different. Tonight, Josie was there. And that man had placed himself between Josie and danger faster than Talia's own reflexes could move. She looked over at the picture Josie had drawn last week, taped right beside the refrigerator. Two people holding hands, one bigger and one smaller, standing beneath a blazing yellow sun. Josie had scrawled underneath in crooked capital letters, still misspelling the words, Talia and Josie, U.S. sisters. Talia looked at that drawing every day, but tonight it made her chest feel heavier than usual, because that picture reminded her of one thing. She was everything Josie had. Their mother was gone. Their father had never existed in either of their lives. There was only Talia. What if tonight, things in that alley had gone a different way? What if that man hadn't spoken? What if Josie hadn't only dropped her ice cream, but had seen something no child should ever have to see? Talia drew in a long breath and forced those thoughts down. She didn't have time to be afraid. Fear was a luxury for people who had someone at their back. She didn't. She had only the drawing on the wall, the little sister asleep in the other room, and a night shift starting in 3 hours. She stood, changed into her work clothes, and drank the remaining half glass of water on the table. Then she called the neighbor, asking her to come watch Josie as usual. The woman agreed right away and didn't ask many questions. Talia thanked her, hung up, and looked back at Josie one last time. The little girl was curled up under the blanket, her face peaceful, knowing nothing at all about what had happened in the dark alley. Talia stepped outside, locked the door, and walked to the subway station. She didn't know that the man from the alley that night was sitting on the 47th floor of the building she was about to enter. 2 weeks had passed since the night in the alley. Talia didn't tell anyone about it. Not the neighbor, not her coworkers, not anyone at all. She buried it in the same place where she kept the other things she didn't want to think about, then kept living as if everything were normal. Work the day shift, pick up Josie, come home and cook, wait for Josie to fall asleep, then go to the night shift. Every day was so much the same that she almost forgot that night had happened. Almost. Because every time she passed the Grand Street alley, she still looked to the right, even while her feet kept moving straight ahead. That night, Talia pushed the floor cleaning cart out of the elevator on the 47th floor of the Caldwell building at 1 o'clock in the morning. This was the floor where she rarely saw anyone during the night shift. Most of the office employees left around 6 or 7 in the evening. By the time Talia reached this floor, there were only the automatic hallway lights, the steady hum of the air conditioning, and the thick, heavy silence of a place that had held so many people and now held no one. Talia mopped each square of floor along the hallway, pushing the cart forward slowly. She knew this work so well that her hands moved on their own while her mind drifted somewhere else. When she pushed the cart to the end of the hallway, she stopped in front of the large window. It was a floor-to-ceiling glass window, looking out over the entire Manhattan skyline. The city lights spread below her, millions of tiny lit windows like grains of glowing sand. Talia stood there for a few seconds, the way she did every night when she cleaned this floor. Only a few seconds. Because this was the only moment in her day when the city felt beautiful instead of exhausting. A door opened behind her. Talia turned around. The conference room door at the end of the hallway had just swung open. A man stepped out, phone in hand, his shoulders slightly lowered like someone who had been sitting for a very long time. The hallway light fell across his face. Talia recognized him immediately. She didn't need to look closely. That stance, that way of moving, those straight shoulders. The man from the alley 2 weeks ago. He recognized her too. His steps slowed for a single beat, his eyes stopping on Talia's face for exactly half a second before everything returned to normal. But that half second was enough for Talia to know he remembered. The air in the hallway changed all at once. It wasn't tense the way it had been in the alley, but it wasn't easy either. It felt like two people who both knew the same secret, and neither one wanted to be the first to speak of it. Talia spoke first. "I didn't see anything. Mr. Barrett already told me." Her voice was calm, not shaking, not evasive. She said it as if she were confirming an agreement that had already been signed and needed no further discussion. The man looked at her and didn't answer right away. He slipped the phone into the pocket of his suit jacket and stood about 5 steps away from her. "The little girl that day," he said. "Your sister?" "Yes, my younger sister. Is she all right?" Talia nodded. Then she added something she herself didn't understand why she said. Maybe because the look in his eyes then didn't look like the eyes of someone asking out of politeness. It looked like the eyes of someone who truly wanted to know. "She asked me whether the sad-eyed uncle had any friends." The man didn't answer. His face didn't change expression. He didn't frown, didn't smile, didn't nod. But he also didn't turn away at once. He stood there for a few more seconds, as though her words had touched some place inside him that he didn't want anyone to touch. Then he turned back toward the conference room. Before closing the door, he paused without looking back. "Next time, don't take that alley at night." The door closed. The small click of the lock sounded through the empty hallway. Talia stood there alone, still holding the mop, her eyes fixed on the closed door. She didn't know his name, didn't know what he was doing in that conference room at 1 o'clock in the morning, didn't know what that night meeting had been about, ending at an hour when the whole city had gone to sleep. But she knew one thing. 2 weeks ago, in the dark alley, he had been a stranger. Tonight, he was still a stranger, but now she knew where he was. The 47th floor, the conference room at the end of the hallway, the exact place she cleaned every night. Their second meeting, still brief, still no more than 10 sentences. But this time, the distance between them had narrowed from 10 meters in the alley to 5 steps in the hallway. Talia turned back to the mop and pushed the cart onward. The city still glowed beyond the glass, and the conference room door behind her remained closed and silent. The next morning, just as Talia finished her night shift, she received a message from Margot. 2 words. "Come up." No greeting, no explanation, no question mark. Margot never asked. Margot only gave orders. Margot was the cleaning manager of the Caldwell building, Talia's direct supervisor, and the supervisor of 17 other cleaning employees. In this building, Margot wasn't the most powerful person, not even close to anything that could truly be called power. But for people like Talia, Margot was the one who decided whether they had a job or not, whether they got enough hours to earn a paycheck or not, whether they were pushed into the dead shifts or not. And Margot knew that. She knew it very well. Talia knocked on the door of the management office on the 2nd floor. Margot sat behind her desk, eyes fixed on the computer screen, not looking up when Talia stepped inside. Talia stood and waited. 10 seconds, 20 seconds, 30 seconds. Margot still didn't look up. This was how she established her position every time she called an employee in. She made people stand there and wait, so they would understand who was busy with important work and who wasn't worth hurrying for. 30th floor, Margot finally said, her eyes still on the screen. "East hallway area. Who mopped it last night?" "I did," Talia answered. Someone reported that there was still a stain on the floor, near the elevator. "How do you explain that?" Talia knew she had cleaned the 30th floor more carefully than usual last night, because that was the floor with the large conference room, and she always spent extra time on that area. She also knew the marble floor in the east hallway had an old stain from before she ever started working there. The kind of stain that had sunk deep into the stone and could never be cleaned away with ordinary tools. She knew all of that, but she didn't say it. "I'll mop it again," Talia said. "Mopping it again is obvious, but the problem is standards. How long have you been working here, and you still let something like this happen?" Margot pushed a sheet of paper across the desk. "New schedule. Starting this week, you're moving to Shift C. Shift C, the hardest shift, from 10 o'clock at night to 6 o'clock in the morning, responsible for the floors most people didn't want because they were large, had too many rooms, and had to be finished before the office employees arrived. It meant Talia would get home later, sleep less, and the time between her day shift and night shift would be squeezed so tightly there would almost be nothing left. "Besides that," Margot continued, still not looking up, "this week's hours have been cut by 4 because I have to adjust the staffing budget. You'll receive the detailed schedule by email. 4 hours cut." To someone else, 4 hours might not have been much. To Talia, 4 hours was enough money to buy Josie's food for the whole week. She calculated it in her head, quickly, automatically, the way she always did whenever something changed. She calculated it, then swallowed it down. "I understand," Talia said. And if I get one more complaint about the cleaning quality on any floor under your responsibility, I'll deduct it directly from your pay. No warning. Margot finally looked up, looking at Talia for the first time since she had stepped inside. There was no obvious malice in her eyes, but there was nothing in them that saw Talia as a person either. It was the look someone gave a tool whose performance had disappointed them. You can go. Talia took the new schedule, nodded once, turned, and walked out. She went down the second-floor hallway, past closed office doors, past the employee area, past the rules notice board no one ever read. Her back was straight, her steps steady, her face showing no expression at all. Not because she wasn't angry. She was. She knew that Stain wasn't her fault, knew Shift C was a punishment and not an adjustment, knew the 4 hours cut was Margot's way of reminding her who held power here. She knew all of it, but she also knew something else that mattered more. She needed this job. Josie needed her to have this job. And between pride and next month's rent, Talia had learned which one to choose a very long time ago. She wasn't someone who collapsed because of a few threats. She had endured more than that. Losing her mother at 24, raising her sister since Josie was only 3, working 2 shifts a day for 3 straight years without rest. Margot and her Shift C schedule were only one more thing on the list of things Talia had to get through. Nothing more, nothing less. She stepped into the elevator, pressed the button for the ground floor, and began rearranging the new hours in her head. Shift C started at 10 o'clock at night. Josie went to sleep at 8. The neighbor could come over at 9:30. It could still work. It had to work. That same night, on the 47th floor, inside the conference room Talia was never allowed to enter, an entirely different conversation was taking place. The conference room's ceiling lights were off. There was only the light from a single desk lamp in the corner, enough for them to see one another's faces, but not enough to read their expressions clearly. Paxton Caldwell sat at the head of the table, his back against the chair, both hands resting on the dark wooden surface. Barrett stood behind him, close to the wall, his arms folded across his chest. 3 other men sat across from Paxton. No one made small talk. No one poured water. This wasn't the kind of meeting that began with greetings. One of the 3 men sitting opposite him was named Grady. He was the only one who wasn't leaning back in his chair. He sat slightly forward, both hands on his thighs, his fingers digging into the fabric of his pants. Grady knew why he was here. Everyone in the room knew. The shipment at the port of Newark, Paxton said, his voice even, without emphasis. Gone. All of it. You were in charge of transport. Explain. Grady swallowed. There was an issue in the middle stage. The unloading crew changed the schedule at the last minute without informing us. By the time I knew, it was already too late. I tried to make contact, but I couldn't do it in time. Couldn't do it in time. Paxton repeated those words, not as a question, but so Grady could hear his own answer again. I know this was a serious mistake. I take responsibility. But this is the first time in 4 years that I've... 4 years. Paxton cut him off, still in that same even voice. 4 years. You've worked for me. And you think those 4 years are the reason I should let this pass? Grady didn't answer. The conference room was so quiet they could hear the clock on the wall ticking. Paxton looked at Grady, not angry, not loud. That was what made people fear him more than shouting ever could. Paxton Caldwell never shouted. He only asked questions, and his questions always carried more weight than any threat. Do you have a family? Grady looked up, startled by the question. He looked at Paxton, trying to read the meaning behind it, but Paxton's face gave him nothing. Yes, Grady answered, his voice quieter now. A wife and 2 children. 2 children, Paxton said, nodding slowly. Because you have a family, I'm giving you 24 hours to leave the city. After 24 hours, I won't ask that question again. No further explanation was needed. Grady understood. Everyone in the room understood. Grady stood, nodded once, then walked out of the room. He didn't ask for another word. When the door closed behind Grady, the 2 remaining men sitting across from Paxton stayed silent, their eyes lowered to the table. They had just witnessed Paxton Caldwell's mercy, and they knew that his mercy came only once. Paxton stood and signaled for the other 2 men to leave as well. They rose at once, said nothing more, and walked out quickly, but not so quickly that they looked as if they were running away. Only Paxton and Barrett remained in the conference room. Barrett stepped forward and stood beside the table. He didn't comment on Grady. After 10 years with Paxton, Barrett knew where the line was. There were decisions he didn't need to understand. He only needed to carry them out. "There's something else," Paxton said, his voice changing slightly. Not softer, but different. "The girl from the alley that day. She works in this building." Barrett frowned. "The one who mops the floors? Find out about her." Barrett didn't ask why. He took out his phone, made a note, then nodded. 2 days later, Barrett placed a sheet of paper in front of Paxton. It wasn't a long file, only a few lines. Talia Brennan, 27 years old. Mother died 3 years ago. Father left when she was little, raising her 6-year-old sister alone. Works 2 shifts every day. The day shift as a kitchen assistant at a diner in Brooklyn. The night shift cleaning at the Caldwell building. No bad debts. No criminal record. No one. Paxton finished reading and set the paper down. He said nothing for a few seconds. Then he looked at Barrett. "Don't let anyone fire her." Barrett nodded. He didn't ask why. After 10 years with Paxton, he knew there were times when his boss gave an order not because of strategy or calculation, but because of something he couldn't put into words. Moments like that were rare. And because they were rare, Barrett never asked. The black car glided smoothly through the streets of Manhattan at nearly 3 o'clock in the morning. Barrett sat behind the wheel. Paxton sat in the back, his eyes turned toward the window. At this hour, the city belonged to people who couldn't sleep and people who weren't allowed to sleep. Paxton belonged to both kinds. Barrett drove through 2 intersections before speaking. He wasn't a man of many words, but there were things that had to be said, and they couldn't wait until morning. Troy Sefton is linking up with several groups from the South, 2 contacts in Atlanta and 1 in Miami. Last week, he met privately with Whitmore and proposed dividing the Eastern transport route again. Paxton didn't turn his head. What did Whitmore say? He hasn't agreed, but he hasn't refused either. He's waiting to see which way the wind blows. Whitmore always waits for the wind. That's nothing new. But Troy is. He's spending big money. Buying people, buying partners, building new connections everywhere. He isn't like the others before him, Paxton. He knows how to play the long game. Paxton still looked out the window. The streetlights passed across his face in strips of light and darkness, steady as breathing. "The old man would want you to strike first," Barrett said, his voice dropping a degree lower. The old man was what Barrett still called Paxton's father, even though he'd been dead for 8 years. Barrett had followed Paxton's father from the early days, before Paxton was even old enough to sit at a meeting table. To Barrett, the old man wasn't the past. The old man was the standard, the measure, the question Barrett used whenever he wasn't sure what to do. What would the old man do? Paxton finally turned his face back. He looked at Barrett through the rearview mirror, his eyes calm, but his voice heavier than usual. "The old man trusted the wrong person and lost his life because of it. I won't repeat that." Barrett didn't answer. He knew Paxton hadn't said that to argue. He'd said it to remind himself. 8 years ago, Paxton had been 25, standing beside his father's coffin in a funeral home on the Upper East Side. The room had been full of flowers, full of people, full of handshakes and condolences spoken in low voices. Familiar faces stood around him, patting his shoulder, saying his father had been a great man, saying they would always stand beside him, saying the Caldwell family would never stand alone. And Paxton knew that among those faces, one of them had betrayed his father, had sold information, had pushed his father toward a death that should never have happened. He looked at each person, one by one, every pair of eyes, every nod, and he made himself a promise that he had kept until this day: never trust anyone completely. The car stopped at a red light. Paxton looked outside at the empty corner, where a homeless man was sleeping, curled beneath the awning of a closed store. He watched him for a few seconds, then said, his voice softer, as though he were speaking more to himself than to Barrett. "Troy isn't frightening. He's noisy. He spends money to draw attention, and he thinks attention means strength. But he's wrong. Then what is frightening?" Barrett asked. "The person standing right beside you when you don't know it." Barrett looked at Paxton through the rearview mirror. That sentence wasn't about Troy Sefton. Barrett knew it. Paxton was talking about something else, an older fear, a deeper one, something that had settled into his bones since the day he stood beside his father's coffin. The fear wasn't an enemy outside, it was a traitor within, the person you trusted, the person you thought would never turn their back. His father had died because of someone like that, and Paxton lived every day with the question, who would be next? The light turned green. Barrett pressed the gas, and the car slipped through the night. He didn't comment further. After 10 years beside Paxton, Barrett had learned that there were moments when his boss didn't need advice, didn't need anyone to analyze anything, didn't need anyone to agree or object. He only needed someone to sit there, listen, and not ask questions. Barrett was that person. The car drove along the East River. The lights of the Brooklyn Bridge reflected on the black water. Paxton rested his head against the car window and closed his eyes. He wasn't sleeping. He was only thinking. About Troy, about Whitmore, about the Southern contacts, and about a question he still didn't have an answer to. Among the men who had sat around his meeting table tonight, which one was the person he shouldn't trust? The black car glided across the bridge, heading toward Manhattan, where the Caldwell building stood towering against the skyline. On the 47th floor of that building, a girl had just finished mopping, pushing her cart into the elevator to go down to the ground floor. She knew nothing about Troy Sefton, about Grady, about the shipment lost at the port of Newark, or about the man sitting in the black car that had just passed the building she had just left. But that man already knew her name, already knew where she lived, already knew she was raising her sister alone, and he had already ordered the only person he trusted not to let anyone fire her. In the weeks that followed, Talia saw Paxton 2 more times on the 47th floor. The first time, he was on the phone outside the conference room, his voice low and urgent. She pushed her cart past him. He nodded. She nodded back, and that was all. The next time, he was standing at the end of the hallway, looking out through the glass, his phone in his hand but not making a call, his face heavy, like a man who had just received news he hadn't wanted to hear. She walked past. He nodded. She nodded back. Still the same, nothing more. But something began to change that Talia couldn't explain. Every night she cleaned the 47th floor. When she stopped to rest at the small table beside the window at the end of the hallway, the place where she usually stood and looked at the city for a few seconds before pushing her cart onward, there was always a cup of coffee waiting there. A plain white paper cup, no name written on it, the coffee still warm. The first night, she thought someone had forgotten it. The second night, she began to wonder. The third night, she drank it. From then on, she didn't ask anymore. Whoever left it there, left it there. She needed coffee more than she needed answers. Then came the night Margot cut more hours. It wasn't cutting hours the way she had before. This time, Margot scheduled Talia to cover for an employee who had called in sick without warning, which meant Talia had to work the day shift at the Brooklyn diner from morning until 3 o'clock in the afternoon, then come back to the Caldwell building for the evening shift from 4 o'clock to 8 o'clock, then rest for 2 hours, then begin the night shift at 10 o'clock. Nearly 20 hours of work, broken only by 2 hours sitting on a plastic chair in the basement staff room, trying to close her eyes but unable to sleep because her back hurt and her head buzzed. By 12 o'clock at night, when Talia pushed the mopping cart out of the elevator on the 47th floor, her legs felt as if she were dragging something behind her. She had cleaned half the hallway when she stopped, not because she wanted a break, because her legs couldn't take another step. She pushed the cart close to the wall, sat down on the floor, leaned her back against the wall, and drew her knees up. The cold stone floor seeped through the thin fabric of her pants. She closed her eyes. Footsteps stopped a few meters away from her. Talia opened her eyes. Paxton was standing there, phone in hand, the screen's light falling across his face. He had just stepped out of the conference room and seen her sitting on the floor in the middle of the empty hallway. He didn't ask whether she was all right, didn't ask whether she was tired, didn't ask anything at all. He only looked at her, then slipped his phone into his pocket, then sat down on the floor, about 3 steps away from her. His back against the opposite wall, both legs stretched out in front of him. Talia looked at him. She didn't understand why a man in a suit would sit on a hallway floor at midnight just because she was sitting there. But she didn't ask. She was too tired to ask. "What time did you start your shift today?" Paxton said, his voice normal, as if he were asking a normal question. 6 o'clock in the morning. 6 o'clock in the morning, until now. Yes. Paxton said nothing more about it. He didn't frown, didn't shake his head, didn't show pity. He only gave a slight nod, as though her answer confirmed something he had already known but needed to hear directly. Your sister, Josie, he said after a while. What does she do when you're at work? The neighbor watches her. Josie's asleep before I leave. Every night? Every night. Then silence. Not the heavy or awkward kind of silence. It was the kind of silence between two people who had said enough and didn't need to force more words into the empty space. Talia closed her eyes again, her head resting against the wall. She heard Paxton breathing, steady and slow, from the other side of the hallway. He was still sitting there. She didn't know how long he sat. Maybe 5 minutes. Maybe 15. She didn't open her eyes to check. But she knew he hadn't stood up and left, because she didn't hear footsteps. And in a strange way, that quiet presence made her feel lighter. Not because he helped. He didn't help at all. He only sat there. But sometimes, having someone sit with you when you're tired is already enough. When Talia opened her eyes, Paxton had stood up and was walking toward the elevator. He didn't look back, didn't say goodbye, didn't say get some rest, or any of the empty phrases people said just to say something. He only walked away. Talia watched him until the elevator doors closed. Then she stood, picked up the mop again, and pushed the cart onward. Her legs were still tired, her back still hurt, but something was different, a little lighter. Inside, she looked out through the glass at the end of the hallway. The city was still glowing, and on the small table beside the window, there was still the wet ring left by the coffee cup she had already finished earlier. 3 days after the night they sat in the hallway on the 47th floor, Talia's phone vibrated at 11 o'clock at night. She was mopping the 32nd floor, and when she looked at the screen, she saw the neighbor's number. The woman never called at this hour unless something had happened. Talia, come home. Josie's sick. She's burning up. I think we need to take her to the hospital. Talia leaned the mop against the wall and went straight into the elevator down to the 2nd floor. Margot's office was still lit. Talia knocked on the door and stepped in without waiting for an answer. My sister is sick. I need to leave right now. Margot sat behind her desk, looking at Talia over her glasses. The night shift ends at 6 o'clock in the morning. You still have 7 hours left. My sister is only 6. The neighbor says she needs to go to the hospital. And who's going to clean the 5 floors you have left? I don't have anyone to replace you in the middle of the night. You leave, you lose the shift. What does lose the shift mean? It means I erase tonight's shift from payroll. You don't finish, you don't get counted. Talia looked at Margot. Margot looked back. No yielding. This was the smallest kind of power in the world, the power of a cleaning manager over a woman who mopped floors. But Margot used it as if she held someone's fate in her hands. And in truth, she was right. Because to Talia, losing one shift's pay meant losing Josie's food money for the entire week. Talia nodded. I understand. Then she turned and walked out. She still left. 25 minutes later, Talia pushed open the door to the apartment. The neighbor was sitting beside Josie on the bed, placing a wet towel on the little girl's forehead. Josie lay curled under the blanket, her face red, her eyes dull but still open. When she saw Talia, she smiled, a weak smile, but still a smile. Sissy, you're home? Grandma said I'm sick, but I feel okay. Talia sat down beside her, touching Josie's forehead, hot. She turned to the neighbor. How long have you been here? About half an hour. She said she was tired, then lay down and couldn't get back up. I took her temperature and it was too high, so I called you. Talia thanked the woman, lifted Josie into her arms, wrapped the blanket around her, and called a taxi. Josie clung to her sister, burying her face into Talia's neck as they hurried to the hospital. But this time, the child's body was burning through the blanket. In the taxi on the way to the hospital, Josie told her sister about school. Today, the teacher let us draw the animal we liked best. I drew a cat, but Tommy said my cat looked like a mouse. I said a mouse is cute too. Josie told the story in a tired voice, broken by pauses because she had to stop and breathe, but she still told it, because she knew that when Talia was quiet for too long, it meant her sister was worried. And Josie didn't want her sister to worry. The hospital at midnight was a world of its own. Talia sat in the emergency room waiting area, Josie lying across her lap, her eyes opening and closing. The doctor examined her and said she needed more observation, that she might have to stay in the hospital for a few days. Talia nodded and asked the only question that mattered. How much will it cost? The number the doctor gave her made Talia unable to answer right away. She repeated it in her head, broke it into pieces, compared it with her monthly pay, with rent, with the money in the tin box under the bed. She knew immediately. It wasn't enough. It wasn't even close to enough. I understand, Talia said to the doctor. She'll stay. Josie was taken into a hospital room, lying on a white bed, under a white blanket, surrounded by white walls. The little girl looked around and held her sister's hand. You're staying here with me, right? I'm staying. All night too? All night too. Josie smiled, then closed her eyes and fell asleep. Talia sat beside her, holding her hand, watching Josie's face slowly settle into peace as she slept. She sat there until morning and didn't close her eyes for even a minute. At 7 o'clock in the morning, after Josie had fallen into deep sleep and the nurse had finished checking on her, Talia stepped out into the hospital hallway and called the neighbor, asking whether she could come watch Josie that afternoon so Talia could go to work. Then she took a taxi home. The apartment was silent. Josie's bed was empty. Talia sat down on the kitchen floor, her back against the refrigerator, in the same place where she had sat the night she came home from the alley. She pulled the tin box out from under the bed and opened the lid. Inside was the cash she had saved month by month, neatly stacked and held together with rubber bands. She counted it again, then counted it one more time, as if counting one more time could somehow make there be more. But no, the money in the tin box wasn't enough to pay even half the hospital bill. Talia closed the lid and set the box down on the floor. She looked up at the wall, at the drawing Josie had made of the two sisters holding hands beneath the sun. And for the first time in a very long while, she cried. She didn't cry out loud, didn't gasp for air, didn't break down screaming. The tears simply ran down her cheeks, then down her chin, then fell onto her knees, silently. The way she had lived for the past 3 years, silently enduring, silently carrying, silently hurting, because there was no one to cry in front of, and because Josie, even lying in the hospital, wasn't allowed to know that her sister cried. 15 minutes later, Talia wiped her face, stood up, and changed for work. She locked the door, stepped outside, and walked to the subway station. Her face looked normal. Her steps were normal. Her eyes were a little red, but anyone who saw her would think she was only short on sleep. No one at the Caldwell building knew she had cried on the kitchen floor the night before. Talia wasn't the kind of person who told people about her suffering. She endured, counted money, wiped her tears, and went to work. That was how she lived. But there was one person who would know about this, even though she didn't say a word, because that person already knew her name, knew her circumstances, and was watching everything that happened to her from the 47th floor of the building she had just entered. 2 days later, Talia was sitting beside Josie's hospital bed when her phone vibrated, a message from the hospital's billing department. She opened it and read it again, then read it a third time. Josie's entire hospital bill had been paid. All of it, not a single penny missing. The payer was listed as anonymous donor. No name, no phone number, no contact address. Only 2 words, anonymous donor. Talia set the phone down and looked at Josie, who was asleep in the hospital bed. The little girl was much better now, her cheeks no longer so red, her breathing steady again. The doctor said she might be discharged in a day or 2. Talia should have been happy. She should have breathed in relief. But instead of happiness, she felt anger. Not anger because someone had paid the bill. Anger because she knew exactly who had paid it, and that person had done it without saying a word, without asking whether she agreed, without giving her the chance to refuse. She knew who it was, because no one else in this world knew her situation and had enough money to pay a hospital bill under 2 words. Anonymous donor. A passerby wouldn't do that. A coworker wouldn't do that. The neighbor certainly wouldn't. Only one person knew she was raising her sister alone, knew she worked 2 shifts, knew she mopped the floors on the 47th floor every night. The man who had sat with her in the empty hallway the night before without saying a word. That evening, Talia began her night shift as usual. She cleaned from the lower floors upward, slowly, steadily, but her mind wasn't there. Her mind was on the 47th floor. When the elevator opened on that floor, she saw light slipping through the crack beneath the conference room door at the end of the hallway. He was still here. Talia didn't push the mopping cart forward. She walked straight to the conference room, knocked twice, then pushed the door open without waiting for an answer. Paxton was sitting behind the table, papers spread out in front of him, while Barrett stood beside him, saying something. Both of them stopped when they saw Talia. Barrett looked at her, then looked at Paxton. Paxton gave Barrett a slight nod. Barrett stepped outside and closed the door behind him. Only the two of them remained in the conference room. Talia stood in front of the table and looked straight at Paxton. "I don't accept pity money." Her voice didn't shake. She didn't raise it. But it was clear and further only someone who had long been used to standing on her own 2 feet could speak. She didn't say thank you. She didn't ask why. She only said she didn't accept it. Paxton looked at her. He didn't seem surprised, didn't become defensive, didn't offer some winding explanation. He looked at her with calm eyes, but they were deeper than usual, as if Talia's words had opened a door he didn't want anyone to step through. It wasn't pity. Then what was it? Paxton was silent for a while. Not the kind of silence that came from searching for an answer. The kind of silence that came because the answer was already there, and he wasn't sure he wanted to say it out loud. "I know what it feels like to be about to lose someone and not be able to do anything." His voice was lower, slower, heavier. "Don't make me stand by and watch again." Talia looked at Paxton. That sentence wasn't meant for her. Or rather, it wasn't meant only for her. He was speaking about someone else, another time, a loss he had carried for years without telling anyone. She didn't know the details. She didn't need to know. But in his voice, she recognized something she knew better than anyone, because she heard it in her own voice every day. It was the voice of someone who had lost too much. She said nothing more. She didn't thank him. She didn't refuse again. She only stood there looking at him for a few more seconds, then nodded once, turned, and walked out. The conference room door closed behind her. Barrett was waiting in the hallway. He watched Talia pass, then stepped into the conference room. Paxton was still sitting in the same place, his eyes fixed on the empty space in front of him. "Why did you do that?" Barrett asked, his voice without judgment, only a direct question from a man who had walked beside Paxton long enough to be allowed to ask. Paxton didn't answer. He reached for the stack of papers on the table and continued reading as though the conversation just now had never happened. Barrett stood there for a few more seconds, looking at his boss. In 10 years following Paxton, he had seen him give orders, negotiate, corner people, spare people, build and destroy. But all of it had a reason. All of it belonged to a larger chessboard that Paxton always controlled. This time was different. Paying the hospital bill for a floor cleaner's little sister brought no strategic benefit. It didn't expand territory. It didn't create an alliance. It didn't remove an opponent. It was simply the act of a man who had seen something in a woman that he couldn't look away from. Barrett realized that, and he didn't know how he should feel. Relieved because after 10 years, Paxton still had something human left behind the armor of power, or worried because in their world, that human part was exactly the weakness enemies were always searching for. Barrett turned, stepped outside, and closed the conference room door. Out in the hallway, the girl who mopped the floors had already pushed her cart far away, leaving only the steady sound of its wheels rolling over the stone floor, echoing through the quiet emptiness of the 47th floor. The next day, Margot received an internal call from the 47th floor. Not from human resources, not from building management, from Paxton Caldwell's office. Margot had never received a call from that floor in all 9 years she had worked here. She knew who Paxton Caldwell was. Everyone in the building knew. But knowing and being summoned to meet him were two entirely different things. Margot stepped into the office at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Paxton sat behind his desk, Barrett standing beside the door. No one invited Margot to sit. She stood in front of the desk, both hands clenched at her sides, trying to hold on to an air of confidence, but her eyes flicked quickly toward Barrett before returning to Paxton. Paxton didn't greet her. He opened a drawer, took out a neatly stapled stack of papers, placed it on the desk, and turned it toward Margot. "Do you know what this is?" Margot looked down. The first page was the night shift timesheet for the past 6 months. Every line had been marked in red, wherever the hours had been cut, compared with the contract. The second page was the payroll record, with deductions that had no explanation. The third page was 3 complaints from former employees, none of which had ever been handled. Margot recognized every number, every name, every deduction, because she was the one who had created them. "You have two choices," Paxton said, his voice even, as though he were reading a contract clause. "One, you change the way you manage, repay the wages that were wrongfully deducted from the employees, and I'll consider this as if it never happened. Two, I send this file to Human Resources and the labor attorney. You answer before 8 o'clock tomorrow morning." Margot opened her mouth as if she meant to say something. Maybe an explanation, maybe a justification, but she looked into Paxton's eyes and decided not to speak. Because there was no room for explanation in those eyes. There were only two choices, and both were so clear they didn't need one more word. "I understand," Margot said. "Good." Paxton pulled the stack of papers back and put it into the drawer. "Barrett will show you out." Margot turned and walked out, her back straight, but her steps quicker than when she had entered. She didn't look at Barrett as she passed him. The next morning, before 8 o'clock, Margot sent an email confirming that she would make the changes and repay the wages that had been wrongfully deducted. From that day on, Margot no longer called Talia up to her office. No nitpicking, no cutting hours, no assigning punishing shifts. She didn't change because of conscience. She changed because of fear. But to Talia, the reason didn't matter. Only the result mattered. 4 days later, near 1 o'clock in the morning, Talia pushed the mopping cart through the hallway on the 47th floor. The door to Paxton's office was slightly open, and the desk lamp cast a thin strip of light across the stone floor. Talia stopped and looked through the gap. Paxton had dropped his head onto the desk. Both arms rested on the tabletop, his forehead leaning against his wrist. Papers around him were scattered in disorder. His phone lay face down beside them, the screen dark. He wasn't asleep. Talia knew because his shoulders weren't relaxed, and his jaw was still clenched. He had only folded down because he no longer had the strength to sit upright. Talia looked around the hallway. No Barrett. No one. Only her and the man behind that half-open door. She went back to her cart, opened the lower compartment, and took out a plastic container. It was the meal she had brought for her night shift. White rice, fried eggs, stir-fried vegetables. The meal she had cooked at 7 o'clock in the evening before leaving for work, divided into 2 portions. One left in the refrigerator for Josie to eat in the morning, one brought with her. She looked at the container, then at the half-open door, then back at the container again. She pushed the door open and stepped inside. Paxton lifted his head when he heard footsteps. His eyes were red with exhaustion, his face heavier than usual. He looked at Talia, then at the food container in her hand. Talia placed the container on the desk, right in front of him, in the middle of the scattered papers. "You paid my sister's hospital bill. I'm paying you back with a meal. The debt isn't cleared, but this is the first step." Paxton looked at the container. The clear plastic lid revealed neatly packed white rice, golden fried eggs, and stir-fried vegetables with a little oil still clinging to the side of the box. Nothing special. Not a meal from a restaurant. Not delivery. Just home-cooked food, made by hand, shared from the portion of a woman raising her little sister alone on a floor cleaner's wages. He opened the lid. The scent of white rice and fried eggs spread through a room that had held only the smell of paper and cold coffee. Paxton looked at that meal for a few more seconds. This was the simplest meal he had seen in 10 years. Over the past 10 years, he had eaten dinner in the most expensive restaurants in Manhattan, drunk wine where one bottle cost as much as Talia's monthly wages, sat at tables where the servers remembered his name and his preferences, but none of them had cooked for him. Paxton finished the entire container. He said nothing while he ate. Talia said nothing either. She stood beside the door, one shoulder resting against the frame, looking out into the hallway while he ate. She didn't watch him eat because she knew no one wanted to be watched when they needed something they didn't want to admit they needed. When Paxton set the fork down, the food container was empty. Talia turned back, picked it up, nodded once, and walked out. No thanks, no goodbye, no further words. The door closed softly behind her. Paxton sat alone in his office, looking at the place where the food container had just been. A small, damp ring marked the wooden desk, and it would dry within a few minutes. But the feeling that had just settled inside him wouldn't. He had just received something money couldn't buy, power couldn't demand, and 10 years sitting at the top of an empire had never brought him. Real care, from someone who needed nothing from him, wasn't afraid of him, and wanted nothing from him. Just one meal. but it weighed more than any deal he had ever signed. Troy Sefton didn't wait any longer. Over the past several weeks, he had been forming links, buying loyalty, and building relationships all across the South. But those things were preparation. Now Troy wanted to send a message, not with words, with action. And that message had to be heavy enough for Paxton Caldwell to understand that the game had changed. Barrett called Paxton at 10 o'clock at night. Paxton was sitting in the car on his way home after a meeting. He picked up, listened to Barrett say 3 sentences. Only 3 sentences. Then Barrett fell silent and waited on the other end of the line. Paxton didn't answer right away. He lowered the phone to his lap, his eyes looking straight through the windshield into the darkness ahead. The driver glanced through the rearview mirror, saw his boss's face, and automatically looked back at the road. There were moments when anyone near Paxton knew not to look, not to ask, not to breathe too loudly. The person Troy had struck was Holt. Holt had followed Paxton for 6 years. He wasn't the closest man, wasn't high-ranking, but he was loyal. The kind of loyalty that didn't make noise, didn't swear oaths, only did the job assigned and never questioned it. Holt was in charge of the northern transport route, the smallest route, the least profitable route, but the most stable one because Holt was careful. Troy chose Holt not because Holt was important, but because Holt wasn't important. That was the message. Troy was telling Paxton that he could touch anyone at any time, even the people Paxton thought no one would bother noticing. Paxton lifted the phone back to his ear. "Where is Holt's family?" "His wife and child are in Queens. They don't know yet," Barrett answered. "Give me his wife's number." Barrett read the number. Paxton memorized it, ended the call with Barrett, then dialed the new number. The phone rang 3 times. A woman's voice answered. Ordinary. The voice of someone at home at 10 o'clock at night who didn't know the world had just changed. "Are you Holt's wife?" "Yes. Who is this?" "I'm Paxton Caldwell. Your husband worked for me." Silence on the other end of the line. The woman knew that name, knew who her husband worked for, and knew that when the boss himself called at 10 o'clock at night, it wasn't an ordinary call. "Your husband won't be coming home." Paxton spoke slowly, each word clear, not because he wanted to emphasize it, because each word was heavier than the one before. "I'm sorry. From now on, your family will be taken care of." A sharp breath came from the other end of the line. Then crying. Not loud crying, the crying of someone who had just understood, but hadn't yet had time to believe it. Paxton listened to that crying for 3 more seconds. Then he ended the call. The car was still moving through the streets of Manhattan. The streetlights still slipped past. The city still lived. But inside this black car, everything had stopped. Paxton looked at the phone in his hand. Then he looked at the glass of whiskey on the tray in the middle of the car, the glass he had poured when he got in and still hadn't taken a sip from. He picked it up. He didn't drink. He threw the glass at the divider in front of him. Glass shattered. Whiskey splashed across his skin. Shards fell onto the car floor. The driver startled, but didn't turn around. No one turned around. That was the only time in this entire story that Paxton Caldwell lost control. Not because of anger, because of helplessness. Because he knew Holt hadn't died because Holt had done anything wrong. Holt had died because he was Paxton's man, and Paxton hadn't been able to protect him. 20 minutes later, Paxton sat in his office on the 47th floor. Barrett stood across from him, having cleared the broken glass from the car before coming up here. He didn't comment on the glass of whiskey. He only set a glass of water in front of Paxton and stood waiting. "Troy wants war," Paxton said, his voice already back to normal, or at least the version of normal he forced himself to wear. "Fine." Barrett nodded, but then he added one more sentence, the sentence he had been holding inside for weeks. "There's a problem. Troy knows every move we make in advance. Schedules, meetings, transport routes. He knew where Holt was, knew which route Holt handled, knew when Holt would be alone. That information isn't on the street. It came from the inside." Paxton looked at Barrett. He wasn't surprised. He had suspected it for a long time. Since the night he sat in the car and told Barrett that the most frightening person was the one standing beside you. But suspicion and confirmation were 2 different things. With suspicion, there was still room to hope you were wrong. With confirmation, that hope died. "There's an informant," Barrett said. Not as a question. "There's an informant," Paxton repeated, his voice flat. He nodded slowly, his eyes on the glass of water in front of him, though he wasn't seeing the glass. He was seeing the list of faces seated around his meeting table, the people he had trusted, the people who had followed him through the hardest years after his father died. One of them was selling him to Troy Sefton. He wasn't afraid of an enemy outside. Troy was noisy, greedy, and foolish in the way of men who thought money could solve everything. Paxton knew how to deal with Troy, but the person standing right beside him, eating at his table, knowing every secret he kept, and counting every step he took so he could report it to the enemy, that was different. That person was the frightening one, and Paxton would find him, not by asking, by setting a trap. Troy Sefton didn't only know how to strike at Paxton's people. He also knew how to strike where Paxton wasn't guarded. Information about Talia reached Troy through the exact source Paxton had not yet found. A source from inside his own organization. Not many details. Just enough for Troy to know that there was a girl who mopped floors at the Caldwell building, and Paxton Caldwell, a man who never cared about anyone outside the organization, had paid her little sister's hospital bill. That was enough. Troy didn't need to know more. He only needed to know that Paxton had a weak spot he hadn't had before, and that weak spot had a name, had an address, and walked alone through the streets of New York every night. Troy sent 2 men to follow Talia. They didn't do anything. They only followed. They wrote down the route she took from home to the Caldwell building. Wrote down the time she left home, the time she entered the building, the time she returned. Wrote down where she picked up her little sister, what the neighbor who watched Josie was named, which floor the apartment was on. They wrote down everything. Then Troy waited for the right moment to send his message. That night, Talia left home at 9:45. Josie was already asleep, and the neighbor had already come over. Talia walked to the subway station as usual, passed 2 streets, then turned left at the familiar corner. Brooklyn's streets still had people at that hour, but fewer now. The lights from the stores had mostly gone out, leaving only the street lights and a few apartment windows still glowing above. She turned onto the street leading to the station, then stopped. 3 men stood on the sidewalk ahead of her, about 5 meters away. They didn't block her path by spreading their arms or stepping forward. They only stood there. 3 men, standing in a line, their faces turned toward her, not speaking, not moving, just looking. Talia stopped walking. The instinct of someone who had lived in this city long enough told her these weren't 3 men waiting for a taxi or standing around smoking. Their eyes were too focused, too deliberate, fixed straight on her and only on her. She looked to the right, toward the small street leading back the other way. Looked to the left, at the closed store with no one around. Then looked ahead again. The 3 men were still standing there, still looking. Then the man in the middle tilted his head slightly, slowly, as if he were memorizing her face one last time. Then all 3 turned around and walked away, each in a different direction, dissolving into the street as though they had never been there at all. Talia stood alone on the sidewalk, her heart pounding, both hands gripping the strap of her bag. She hadn't been hit, hadn't been threatened. No one had said a single word to her, but she understood. The message was clearer than any words. We know who you are. We know where you live. We can come any time. And the first thing Talia thought of wasn't herself. It was Josie. Josie was asleep at home, 3 blocks away. Josie was 6 years old and knew nothing about the world outside that small apartment. If these people knew where Talia went every night, then they also knew where Josie was. Talia quickened her pace to the subway station, got on the train, and went to the Caldwell building. She worked through that entire night, her hands mopping floors while her mind didn't have one peaceful second. The next morning, Barrett called Paxton. The security camera on the street corner near the Brooklyn subway station had recorded the scene of 3 men standing in Talia's way the night before. Barrett identified one of the 3 as one of Troy Sefton's men. That afternoon, just as Talia had finished her day shift at the Brooklyn diner and was walking home to get ready for the night shift, a black car pulled up beside the curb in front of her. The door opened. Paxton stepped out. Talia stopped. This was the first time she had seen him outside the Caldwell building since the night in the alley. He stood in front of her, in the middle of the street, in broad daylight, with no empty hallway or dark conference room to hide this conversation. "Someone is watching you," Paxton said, without circling around it. "Last night, 3 men blocked your way near the subway station. The camera caught it. They belong to someone who is trying to put pressure on me. Talia looked at him. She didn't ask who, didn't ask why, didn't ask what kind of pressure. She asked the only question that mattered. Is Josie in danger? I can protect you and Josie, but you have to trust me. Talia looked straight into Paxton's eyes. Not the way someone looked when searching for reassurance. The way someone looked when weighing, calculating, deciding. She had lived alone long enough to know that a promise of protection from anyone always came with a price. And she needed to know what that price was. If being close to you puts my sister in danger, I'll leave right now, she said, her voice clear. I don't need your protection. I just need to know the truth. Paxton looked at her. For the first time in a very long while, someone stood in front of him and didn't demand protection, didn't ask for help, but demanded the truth. Most people around him wanted money, wanted power, wanted shelter beneath his name. Talia wanted to know whether she should stay or go, and she was ready to go if staying meant Josie would be dragged into it. Paxton was forced into a position he wasn't used to. He was used to giving orders, used to control, used to being the one who decided. But in front of Talia, he couldn't order her to stay, and he also couldn't let her leave without protection. He had to choose between protecting her and telling the truth. And for the first time, he chose both. I'll protect both of you, but I need you to stay. Talia looked at him for one more second. Why? Paxton didn't answer. He turned and walked back toward the car, opened the door, then stopped. He didn't look back. He stood there for a few seconds, as though the answer were right on the tip of his tongue, but he wasn't ready to say it yet. Then he got into the car. The door closed. The car rolled away. Talia stood on the sidewalk, watching the black car disappear at the end of the street. He hadn't answered her question, but the very fact that he hadn't answered was already the answer. Paxton didn't look for the informant by asking questions. He looked by feeding bait. Over the following week, Paxton met privately with the 4 closest men in the organization. 4 private meetings, 4 different days, 4 different locations. Each man received one piece of information about Paxton's next move. Every piece of information seemed important. Every piece seemed real, but each man received a different version. The first man was told that Paxton would meet a partner in Boston on Thursday. The second heard that Paxton would move the transport route to the port of Philadelphia over the weekend. The third was told that Paxton was negotiating to buy a warehouse in New Jersey. And the fourth heard that Paxton would pull his men out of the southern area to concentrate them in Manhattan. 4 versions. 4 men. All they had to do was wait and see which version Troy Sefton reacted to. Barrett watched. They didn't have to wait long. 3 days later, through his own sources, Barrett confirmed that Troy had just sent men to the port of Philadelphia. The second version. The second man who had received the information. Dwight. Barrett placed the result in front of Paxton. He didn't say the name. He only set the paper on the desk, then stood still and waited. Paxton looked down, read it, then lifted his eyes to Barrett. Barrett nodded in confirmation. No more words were needed. Dwight, the man who had followed Paxton for 10 years, even before Barrett. Dwight had stood beside Paxton's father from the early days, when the Caldwell Empire didn't yet have the 47th floor, didn't yet have the building, didn't yet have a name that made the entire East Coast wary. Dwight had stood in the funeral home on the day Paxton's father died, right in the front row, his eyes red, his hands clenched. Dwight was the one who had placed a hand on the shoulder of 25-year-old Paxton and said, "I'm here, I'm not going anywhere." And Paxton had believed him. For the 8 years after that, Paxton trusted Dwight more than anyone else in the world, even Barrett. Because Barrett was loyal through reason, but Dwight was loyal through feeling, through memory, through the years he had walked beside Paxton's father, or at least, that was what Paxton thought. Paxton called Dwight to the office on the 47th floor at 11 o'clock at night. Only the 2 of them were in the room. Barrett stood outside the door. Dwight stepped in, saw Paxton sitting behind the desk, and immediately understood that the air in the room wasn't normal. He had lived long enough in this world to know when a room was waiting for something. But he still sat down, because if he stood up and walked away now, that would be a confession. Paxton didn't begin with an opening. He pushed the paper across the desk. On it was the information Dwight had received, and beside it was confirmation from Barrett's source that Troy had acted on that exact information. 1 + 1 = 2. No lawyer needed. No trial needed. Dwight looked at the paper, looked at it for a long time. Then he lifted his eyes to Paxton. He didn't deny it. Troy promised me something you never gave me. Recognition. Dwight's voice didn't shake, didn't sound afraid. It was flat, tired, like the voice of a man who had carried a secret for too long and was finally allowed to set it down. He didn't beg for mercy, didn't offer a long explanation, just one sentence. Recognition. Paxton looked at Dwight, silent. This was the heaviest silence in this story. Not the silence of a man thinking, but the silence of a man feeling the full weight of betrayal pressed down on his chest, without knowing how to breathe. 10 years. Dwight had been beside him for 10 years. Had sat in meeting rooms with him through thousands of nights. Had known every secret, every route, every face, and all that time he had been selling him piece by piece to the enemy. I trusted you more than anyone, Paxton said, his voice slow, every word clear. And you knew that. Dwight lowered his head, not because he was afraid, because that sentence was too true. He knew Paxton trusted him. He knew it was the rarest trust Paxton had given anyone since the day his father died. And he had taken that trust, broken it, then handed it to Troy Sefton in exchange for something Paxton had thought he didn't need to give because it was already there. Recognition. Dwight wanted to be seen, wanted to be treated like someone important, not someone standing behind the others. And Paxton, for 10 years, had trusted Dwight deeply enough that he had never thought he needed to say it out loud. Paxton stood. He walked past Dwight and opened the door. Barrett was right outside. Take him away. I don't want to see his face again. Barrett nodded and stepped into the room. Dwight stood, not looking at Paxton as he passed him. The door closed. Paxton stood alone in the hallway on the 47th floor. This was the floor she still cleaned every night. The window at the end of the hallway still looked out over the city. The cup of coffee was no longer on the table, because tonight, no one had thought of it. He stood there, his back against the wall, his eyes lowered to the floor. History was repeating itself. His father had died because he was betrayed by the person closest to him. And now, the person Paxton had trusted most over the past 8 years had turned his back too. He had built everything on the belief that he would never make the same mistake his father had, that he would never trust the wrong person, that he would see the traitor before it was too late. But he hadn't seen it. 10 years. And for those 10 years, Dwight had sat beside him every day. Paxton stood in the empty hallway, looking like a tired man for the first time, not tired in body. His body was still straight, his shoulders still level, his hands still tucked in the pockets of his suit jacket. But his eyes were tired. Tired from trusting, tired from losing, tired from knowing that in this world, the most expensive thing wasn't money or power, but trust. And it had just been taken from him once again. Troy knew Dwight had been exposed before Dwight was even called into the conference room. Because Dwight didn't make contact on schedule. Every week, Dwight sent Troy information through a private channel at one fixed time window. When that window passed without a message, Troy understood immediately. Dwight was gone. The card inside had been pulled, and if Paxton had found Dwight, it meant Paxton was preparing to strike back. Troy had no time to wait. He acted that very night. Talia left home at 9:45, the way she always did. Josie was already asleep, and the neighbor had already come over. She walked to the subway station, past the 2 familiar streets, then turned left at the corner. The road she had taken hundreds of times. But tonight, the moment she turned onto the street leading to the station, a dark-colored car slid close to the curb beside her. The door opened. 2 men stepped out, one in front of her, one behind her. No talking, no explanation. The man in front blocked her path. The man behind stood close. Talia was trapped between them before she could even think about running. The man in front said exactly one sentence, his voice low and quick. Get in the car. Stay quiet. No one will hurt you if you cooperate. Talia looked around. The street was empty. No one was walking. There was no camera on this stretch because she had already turned off the main street. She looked back at the man in front of her, then at the man behind her, then into the car. She knew she had no choice. Not because she was weak, because running right now would only make everything worse. She got into the car drove away. No one spoke. Talia sat between the 2 men in the back seat, her eyes straight ahead, her hands gripping the strap of her bag on her lap. She didn't cry, didn't tremble. She thought of Josie. Josie was asleep. Josie knew nothing. Josie was safe at home with the neighbor. As long as Josie was safe, Talia could endure. 30 minutes later, the car stopped in front of a warehouse in the industrial district on the south side of the city. The air compressor in the warehouse next door ran in a steady hum. Far away, the horn of a freight train sounded, then faded. Talia was taken inside and seated on a wooden chair in the middle of the room. She wasn't tied up, wasn't blindfolded. Troy didn't need to do that, because she wasn't a threat. She was a message. Troy Sefton walked in 10 minutes later. He was tall and thin, wearing a black shirt untucked over his pants, leather shoes without socks. The kind of man who wanted to look relaxed even while doing something cruel. He looked at Talia in the chair, tilted his head, and smiled faintly. So this is the girl who made Paxton Caldwell forget the rules of the game. Talia didn't answer. She looked at Troy with the same calm eyes she had used to look at Margot, at the diner owner, at everyone who had ever looked down on her. The eyes of someone who was used to being treated badly and refused to let that change the way she saw the world. Troy took out his phone and dialed. The other end picked up after one ring. "Caldwell, she's here. You know what I want." Paxton's voice came through from the other end, calm and cold. "Let me hear her voice." Troy turned the phone toward Talia and put it on speaker. "Talk." Talia looked at the phone. She knew Paxton was listening. She knew he was somewhere in the city, maybe already standing up, maybe already calling Barrett, maybe already preparing to do whatever a man like him would do in a situation like this. And she knew that what she said now would decide how he acted. She didn't cry, didn't beg, didn't say, "Save me." Her voice was so calm that Troy frowned, because he had seen many people sit in that chair before, and all of them had been afraid. All of them except her. "Don't agree to anything because of me," Talia said, her voice clear, slow, each word distinct. "Take care of Josie. She needs you out there more." The other end went silent. Troy looked at Talia, for the first time slightly unsettled because he didn't understand this reaction. She wasn't begging for herself to be spared. She was begging for the 6-year-old little sister asleep in Brooklyn. And she said she needs you, not in a desperate voice, but in the voice of someone giving an order. She was telling Paxton that no matter what happened to her, Josie had to be the priority, not her. Troy didn't end the call right away. He was about to say something when Paxton spoke. "Troy, I'll come." Troy smiled. "I know." The call ended. In the office, on the 47th floor, Paxton set the phone down on the desk. Barrett stood beside him, his earpiece still in, already looping back through the recording of the call. He had heard everything, and he had heard the things Troy hadn't noticed. The freight train horn in the background, clear enough to hear but not too close, which meant within a radius of 1 to 2 kilometers from the tracks. The constant sound of an air compressor, the kind used in industrial cold storage warehouses or packing plants. The Southern Industrial District, near the tracks, with cold storage facilities. Barrett narrowed the range in his head. 3 possible areas, 2 of them with warehouses Troy had used before, according to Dwight's old file. Barrett looked at Paxton. "I need 30 minutes to pinpoint it." Paxton nodded. His hand rested on the desk, and one finger tapped the wooden surface only once. One tap, light, brief. But Barrett knew that sign. He had seen it exactly 3 times in 10 years. Every time, it had come just before Paxton made a decision no one could stop. The storm was coming. Paxton sat still after setting the phone down. Not the kind of stillness he usually carried. The stillness of a man calculating, weighing, arranging chess pieces in his mind. Barrett had seen that kind of silence thousands of times, and he knew how to read it. But this time was different. This time, Paxton wasn't calculating. He had already finished calculating. This silence wasn't the silence of a man thinking. It was the silence of a man who had decided. Barrett stood beside the desk, the earpiece still in his hand, watching his boss. In 10 years beside Paxton, he had seen him angry, seen him cold, seen him control everything with an even voice that made an entire conference room afraid to breathe. But tonight, Barrett saw something he had never seen before. Paxton was quiet in the way the sea is quiet before a tsunami. The surface was flat, but underneath, everything was moving. Then Paxton stood. slowly. He lifted his hands and buttoned his suit jacket, one button at a time, his hands steady, his eyes looking straight ahead. It was his habit before every time he entered an important room. Buttoning his suit jacket was how Paxton Caldwell put on armor. Call everyone. 2 words. Barrett didn't need to hear more. He took out his phone and started calling. But before pressing the first number, he asked, "Plan? Troy wants me to come. I'll come. Location?" She said Josie needs me out there more. She didn't ask me to save her, so I'll decide for myself that I'm going. Barrett nodded and asked nothing else. He knew that when Paxton said, "I'll come," it wasn't an answer to Troy. It was a promise to Talia. Even though she hadn't asked, Barrett opened his laptop and pulled up the map of the Southern Industrial District. The freight train horn in the call, he estimated the distance based on the clarity and delay of the sound. The steady running air compressor, industrial grade, not the small kind used in a store. An area near the tracks, with cold storage warehouses or packing plants. Barrett narrowed it down to 3 areas. Of those, 2 had warehouses Dwight had once mentioned in old reports, back when Dwight had still been Paxton's man. One of those 2 warehouses stood close to the tracks, less than 2 kilometers from the freight classification yard, exactly matching the train horn in the call. The old warehouse on 39th Street, Sunset Park Industrial District, Barrett said. 90%. Paxton nodded. Then he picked up the phone and dialed another number. The other end picked up after 2 rings. "Morrison, now!" Morrison was the lawyer Paxton had planted inside Troy Sefton's system 3 months earlier. Not Paxton's lawyer, Troy's lawyer. Morrison handled all the financial records, contracts, and accounts Troy used to operate. And Morrison had been working for Paxton from the day Troy signed the contract to hire him. Troy didn't know, because Paxton had never activated Morrison. He had kept that card in his hand for 3 months, waiting for the right moment. The reason Paxton had waited wasn't because he wasn't ready. It was because he knew that taking Troy down from the outside was a matter of 1 week. But if he took Troy down while there was still an informant inside the organization, 3 months later there would be a second Troy. Dwight would keep selling information to the next person who appeared. Paxton needed to find Dwight first. Now Dwight had been removed. The informant had been pulled. The conditions were right to activate everything at once. Morrison, freeze all of Troy Sefton's accounts, all of them, starting right now. Morrison confirmed. Paxton ended the call and dialed the next number. Whitmore, the partner who had spent the past few months waiting to see which way the wind would blow. "Whitmore, Troy Sefton will call you in the next few hours. You won't pick up." "Caldwell, I haven't. Troy's accounts are being frozen right now. His lawyer works for me. He has nothing left. Choose." Silence on the other end. Then Whitmore answered, "I understand." Paxton ended the call, then called again. 2 more partners in Atlanta. The same message, the same even voice, the same choice so clear it didn't require thought. One by one, the names Troy had spent months bribing heard Paxton Caldwell's voice on the phone and decided within seconds that they had chosen the wrong side. Barrett finished making the necessary calls, set the phone down, and looked at Paxton. "Done. Everyone is on the way. 20 minutes. Paxton stood in the middle of the office, his suit jacket buttoned, his phone turned off. He looked toward the window at the end of the hallway, the window where Talia often stood, and looked at the city for a few seconds, before pushing her cart onward. The city was still glowing. But in a warehouse in the south, Talia was sitting on a wooden chair, alone, surrounded by Troy's men, and she had told him over the phone not to come because of her. He would come. Troy didn't yet know what was happening outside the 4 walls of that warehouse. He was sitting there waiting for Paxton to arrive, confident that he held the upper hand because he had Talia in his grasp. He didn't know the accounts had been frozen. The partners had turned their backs. The lawyer had betrayed him. And Barrett's team was moving toward the warehouse from 3 directions. Troy thought he was waiting for Paxton to come negotiate. But Paxton wasn't coming to negotiate. He was coming to end it. 2 black cars stopped 2 blocks away from the warehouse on 39th Street. Barrett got out first, his earpiece already in place, his eyes sweeping quickly over the area. The Sunset Park Industrial District at midnight was deserted, with only the orange sodium light spilling down from a few old street lamps and the steady hum of an air compressor running from the warehouse next door. The horn of a freight train sounded from far away. exactly as it had in the call. The right place, Barrett signaled. His team spread out, moving silently toward the warehouse from 3 directions. No noise, no hurry. They had done this enough times to know that speed didn't matter as much as precision. 15 minutes later, Barrett spoke into the earpiece, his voice low. Outside is done. 4 of Troy's men. Secured. No problem. Paxton sat in the car, listening through the earpiece. He nodded, though Barrett couldn't see it. Then he opened the car door and stepped out. Barrett blocked the warehouse entrance and looked at Paxton. I'm going with you. No, I'm going in alone. Paxton, alone. Barrett looked at him. In 10 years, Barrett had learned when to argue and when to step aside. This was the moment to step aside. He opened the warehouse door and pressed himself against the wall, letting Paxton pass through. Inside, the warehouse was wide, with a high ceiling, the fluorescent lights only half on, casting broken patches of brightness and shadow across the concrete floor. Troy Sefton stood in the middle, both hands in his pants pockets, his phone sticking out from the breast pocket of his shirt. Behind Troy, 2 men stood on either side of the door leading to the inner room where Talia was being held. Troy saw Paxton enter alone, without Barrett, without anyone, and he smiled. Alone, brave, or stupid, I haven't decided yet. Paxton stepped into the light and stopped about 5 meters from Troy. He didn't look at the 2 men behind Troy. He looked only at Troy. You know what I want, Troy said, his voice relaxed, as if they were talking in a bar. The Eastern Territory, the transport route, and you pull out of the 3 southern boroughs. In exchange, the girl goes home. Simple. Paxton didn't answer right away. He looked at Troy for a few more seconds, with the kind of look that everyone who had ever sat across from Paxton in a conference room knew. The look of a man who already knew the outcome before the match had even begun. Do you know what's happening outside this warehouse? Paxton asked, his voice calm, as if he were asking about the weather. Troy frowned. My men are outside. 4 men. Barrett had them secured before I walked in. You can check if you want. Troy looked at Paxton, then glanced toward the 2 men behind him. One of them pulled out a phone and called. No one answered. He called again. No one answered. Keep calling if you want, Paxton said. But before you call, let me tell you a few other things. Morrison, your lawyer, the man you hired to manage all your finances. He's been working for me for 3 months. Every account you have was frozen 45 minutes ago. The money you used to buy partners, the money you used to pay your men, the money you used to rent this warehouse, all of it is locked. Troy stood still, his smile fading. He pulled out his phone and called Morrison. It rang 4 times, then went to voicemail. Whitmore, Paxton continued, his voice still even. He won't answer. I spoke to Whitmore an hour ago. He's chosen. The 2 contacts in Atlanta have too. You can call each of them if you want. No one will pick up. Troy dialed Whitmore. It rang. No one answered. He dialed the Atlanta contact. It rang. No one answered. And Dwight, Paxton said, his voice dropping a degree lower when he spoke that name. The only card you had inside my organization. Dwight was removed last night. You have no eyes, no ears, no hands left inside my fence. Troy lowered the phone. He looked around the warehouse. The 2 men behind him were still standing there, but their eyes had changed. They were no longer looking at Paxton like the threat. They were looking at Troy, calculating, wondering whether continuing to stand there was still the right decision. When a boss lost his money, his partners, his lawyer, and his informant all in the same night, the loyalty of his men was measured in minutes, not years. You didn't lose because I'm stronger, Paxton said, taking 1 step forward, his voice never rising, never stressing a word, yet every word fell onto the warehouse concrete like a stone. You lost because no one is truly loyal to you. You buy people with money, buy trust with promises, and you think that's enough. But it isn't. Because when the money is gone and the promises break, you stand alone. That's the difference between you and me. Troy looked at Paxton. For the first time that night, that confident face collapsed. Not from fear, from recognition. He looked around the warehouse, at the 2 men slowly moving back toward the wall, at the phone in his hand with a contact list full of names no one was answering, and he understood. He hadn't lost when Paxton stepped into the warehouse. He had lost the moment Morrison signed with Paxton 3 months ago, the moment Dwight was exposed, The moment Whitmore chose a side, everything had ended before tonight even began. He was only the last person to know. Troy let the phone drop, said nothing. There was nothing left to say. Paxton turned his back and walked toward the door leading into the inner room, where Talia was sitting. Paxton pushed open the door to the inner room. The room was small, empty, with only a wooden chair in the middle and a ceiling bulb shining down. Talia sat on the chair, her back straight, both hands resting on her thighs, her eyes looking directly toward the door. When the door opened and Paxton stepped in, she didn't stand right away. She looked at him, looked carefully, as if confirming that the person standing before her was truly him and no one else. Then she stood, slowly, not because she was weak, because she had been sitting in that chair for hours, alone in an empty room, not knowing what was happening outside, not knowing whether Paxton would come, not knowing whether Josie was safe. She had sat there and waited with the only thing she had, the patience of a person who had spent her whole life waiting. Paxton stepped forward and stopped 2 steps away from her. He looked her over from head to toe. No wounds, no sign that she had been mistreated. Her face was normal, her eyes were normal, and her voice would be normal when she spoke. But her hands weren't. Her hands were trembling, both hands at her sides, her fingers curling slightly, shaking with the kind of tremor the body gives when fear has been held down too long and finally begins to rise. She didn't cry. She didn't let her face betray her, but her hands were something she couldn't control. Paxton saw it. He said nothing about it. Didn't ask whether she was all right. Didn't say she was safe now. Didn't say any of the things people said to comfort someone, because he knew Talia wasn't the kind of person who needed to be comforted with words. She needed to know that someone had seen it, and that was all. He took off his coat, slipped it from his shoulders, folded it once, then placed it over Talia's shoulders, gently, slowly. His hands touched her shoulders for exactly 1 second as he straightened the coat, then let go. It was the first time in this entire story that Paxton touched Talia. Not a hand held, not an embrace. Only placing a coat over her shoulders, the simplest gesture one person could offer another when he didn't know what else to do. But for 2 people who had spent so many weeks speaking through nods, through nameless cups of coffee, through a night shift meal, and through silences in empty hallways, a light touch on the shoulder was more than any words. Talia felt the weight of the coat on her shoulders, warm, the scent of unfamiliar fabric, completely different from everything in her life. She looked up, looked into Paxton's face. This was the first time she had seen him from this distance, closer than ever before. Close enough to see the dark shadows beneath his eyes. Close enough to see that tonight he was tired too, afraid too, racing against time too. "Who are you, really?" she asked, her voice low, not because she was afraid someone would hear, but because the question was heavier than she had expected. She had known him for months now, but she had never truly known him. He was the man in the dark alley, the boss on the 47th floor, the one who left the coffee, the one who paid the hospital bill, the one who sat silently in the hallway when she was exhausted, the one who had just walked into this warehouse alone to bring her out. But who was he? Who was he, really? Paxton looked at her. He didn't answer with a name, with a title, with history, or with the things everyone in this city knew about him. He answered with something no one knew, someone who doesn't want to lose anyone else. Talia heard that sentence, and she understood. Not with logic, with feeling. Because she was someone like that too. She had lost too much as well. Her mother, her father, her childhood, her sleep, her peace. She kept Josie beside her every day because she didn't want to lose anyone else. And the man standing before her, the man holding an entire empire in his hands, was saying the very sentence she told herself every night. She was silent for a while. Then she said, softly, just loud enough for him to hear, "You won't lose me." 3 words. Not a confession of love, not some grand promise. Only a simple confirmation from a woman who was used to walking alone, that this time she chose not to walk away. She chose to stay. Not because he had saved her, but because she saw in him what Josie had seen from the first night in the dark alley, sad eyes. And she didn't want to leave those eyes behind. Barrett stood outside the room, only a few steps away from them. He heard it, not because he was trying to listen, but because the warehouse was so quiet that even breathing carried. He heard Talia's question, Paxton's answer, and the final three words she spoke. Barrett turned his face away and looked out toward the open space in front of the warehouse, where his team was waiting. In 10 years beside Paxton Caldwell, Barrett had seen his boss negotiate with the most dangerous men on the East Coast, give orders no one dared question, and build an empire from the ashes his father had left behind. But tonight, standing outside the warehouse door in Sunset Park at 2 o'clock in the morning, Barrett saw something he had never thought he would see. Paxton didn't look like a boss, didn't look like the man in control, didn't look like the Paxton Caldwell the whole city feared. He looked like an ordinary person, a man who had run through the night across the city, using everything he had, every card he held, every connection he had built, just to step into an empty room and place his coat over the shoulders of a girl who mopped floors. An ordinary person standing before another ordinary person, both of them afraid of losing each other, though neither one said it plainly. Barrett drew in a breath, then spoke into the earpiece, his voice low. "Prepare the car. Take her home." 1 month passed. 1 month since the night at the Sunset Park warehouse. 1 month since the coat on her shoulders and the three words in the empty room. The city still moved, the subway was still crowded, the streetlights still burned, and life still went on the way. Life always goes on, no matter what happened the night before. Talia no longer worked the night shift at the Caldwell building. She quit the week after that night, not because she was afraid, but because she couldn't keep pushing a cleaning cart through the hallway on the 47th floor every night and pretend that everything was still the same. Nothing was the same anymore. The conference room door, the window at the end of the hallway, the small table beside the glass where the cup of coffee had once been waiting, all of it carried memories she couldn't wipe clean with a mop. She still worked the day shift at the Brooklyn diner, still picked up Josie, still cooked dinner, still sat beside her every evening while the little girl drew pictures. Josie had fully recovered, running around and talking endlessly about school. The sisters' life was still small inside the studio apartment in Brooklyn, but it was lighter. Lighter because Talia had only one shift instead of two. Lighter because every night she got to sleep instead of pushing a cart through empty hallways. But the money wasn't lighter. One shift meant half the income. Talia knew she needed to find a new job, and she would find one, her way. 1 week after she quit, Barrett called Talia. His voice was brief, as always. "There's an administrative position at a partner company of Caldwell Holdings. The salary is twice the night shift, normal working hours, full insurance. I'll send the information to your email." Talia listened, then stayed silent for a few seconds. "Who told you to call?" Barrett didn't answer. He didn't need to answer. They both knew. "Thank you, Barrett, but I won't take it. You should read the information before deciding." "I don't need to read it. I'll find a job myself. If I accept because he arranged it, I'll never know whether I'm good enough or not." Barrett hung up and turned to Paxton, who was sitting behind his desk. She refused. Paxton looked up. "Reason?" "She said she wants to find one herself. She wants to know whether she's good enough or not." Paxton looked at Barrett for one more second. Then the corner of his mouth lifted, slightly. Almost impossible to see unless someone was looking closely. That was the first time in this entire story that Paxton Caldwell smiled. Not a broad smile, not a happy laugh, only a thin curve on his lips, the smile of a man who had just heard something that both surprised him and felt familiar, because he recognized that stubbornness. It was like him. "She's more stubborn than half the people I've ever met," Paxton said. Barrett nodded. "I know. I just spoke to her." 3 days later, Talia met Paxton. Not on the 47th floor, not in an empty hallway, but at a small coffee shop near the Caldwell building, where Talia stopped to buy takeout coffee on her way home after the day shift. Paxton was standing on the sidewalk when she came out, a cup of coffee in his hand, as if he happened to be there by chance. But no one just happened to stand in front of a coffee shop in Brooklyn at 3 o'clock in the afternoon when his office was in Manhattan. "Barrett said you refused," Paxton said. "That's right. Why?" I told him why. "You know that position suits you." "I know, but I want to get in through my own ability, not through your name." Paxton looked at her. That small smile appeared again, for the second time. You're more stubborn than half the people I've ever met in my life. Talia looked back at him, her eyes calm. Did anyone in that half dare say no to you? Paxton didn't answer, but the smile was still on his lips when Talia turned and walked away, her coffee in hand, her steps steady toward the subway station. 2 weeks later, Talia applied to a small company in Midtown for an administrative assistant position. She wrote the application at the kitchen table at 10 o'clock at night, after Josie had fallen asleep. She went to the interview on her day off, wearing the most decent clothes she owned, arriving 15 minutes early, sitting with her back straight, answering every question clearly and precisely. She didn't mention Paxton, didn't mention Caldwell Holdings, didn't mention anyone. She talked about time management experience, about her ability to work under pressure, about 3 years of raising her little sister alone without being late to work even once. The interviewer called her back after 2 days. She was hired. Talia found the job herself, applied herself, interviewed herself, got hired herself, without asking Paxton. She proved her worth by herself, with 3 years of never giving up, with 2 shifts every day, and not one word of complaint for anyone to hear. That was how Talia Brennan stepped into a new life. Not because someone opened a door for her, but because she knocked on it herself. One weekend afternoon, Paxton stood in front of the studio apartment in Brooklyn. In his right hand, he held a box of crayons. He stood before the old gray wooden door with peeling paint, looking at the small doorbell on the right. He didn't press it right away. He stood there, 10 seconds, 20 seconds, looking at the door as though it were the hardest door he had ever faced. Paxton Caldwell, the man who had walked into Troy Sefton's warehouse alone without blinking, was standing outside a studio apartment in Brooklyn and hesitating. Because the warehouse was his world, this door was hers, and he wasn't used to stepping into someone else's world without being able to control the outcome. He pressed the bell. Footsteps sounded inside. The door opened. Talia stood there, wearing an old t-shirt, her hair tied high, her eyes moving from Paxton to the box of crayons in his hand. She didn't ask why he had come, didn't ask how he knew the address, didn't ask where he had bought the crayons or whom they were for. She only looked at him for one more second, then stepped aside and opened the door wider. Paxton stepped inside. The small apartment in Brooklyn was warmer than usual that afternoon, not because of the weather, but because there was one more person in it. Josie was sitting on the living room floor drawing when she heard the doorbell. She lifted her head and watched her sister open the door, then saw the man standing outside. Josie narrowed her eyes, looking closely, and then her eyes opened wide. "Sissy, it's the uncle in black," Josie remembered. Children forget quickly, but they remember for a long time the things their feelings attach themselves to. And the little girl had attached her feelings to the sad eyes of the man in the dark alley that night a long time ago. Paxton stepped inside and stood in the middle of the studio apartment, where from the door, one could see straight into the kitchen, and from the kitchen, one could see straight to the bed. The apartment was so small that he felt as though he occupied 1/4 of its space simply by standing there. On the walls, dozens of Josie's crayon drawings were taped everywhere. The picture of the 2 sisters holding hands beneath the sun was still in its old place beside the refrigerator. Paxton looked at that drawing for 1 second, then looked down at the box of crayons in his hand. He bent down and handed the box to Josie. "For you." Josie took it and opened the lid. Inside was a set of 72 crayons, every color Josie had never had before. Until now, she had only drawn with the set of 12 that Talia bought at the dollar store. Several of them worn so blunt that she had to hold them between 2 fingers just to make them right. Josie looked at the 72 crayons arranged neatly in the box, each one still sharp, each color in its own little slot, and her eyes lit up in the way only a child's eyes can when she sees something more beautiful than anything she has ever imagined. "You knew I liked drawing?" Josie looked up at Paxton, her voice full of surprise. "Someone told me," Paxton answered. Josie smiled. A wide smile, unguarded, unhidden, the kind of smile grown-ups have long forgotten how to give. Then she did something no one in the room expected. She took Paxton's hand and tugged him down. "Sit here. Draw with me." Paxton looked down at the tiny hand holding his finger. That hand was 4 times smaller than his fist. That hand knew nothing about Troy Sefton, about Dwight, about sleepless nights, about the shattered glass of whiskey on the car floor. That hand only knew that this uncle had beautiful crayons and that she wanted him to draw with her. Paxton sat down, not on a chair, on the floor, cross-legged, his back slightly bent, holding the sky blue crayon Josie had given him. Josie sat beside him, tilting her head as if she were a little teacher evaluating a new student. Draw clouds. Clouds need light blue, not dark blue. I'll teach you. Paxton held the crayon and placed it on the paper. The last time he had held a crayon was probably 30 years ago, when he was still a child sitting on the floor of another house, in another life. His drawing was clumsy, the curve uneven, the cloud looking like a twisted ball of cotton. Josie looked at it and giggled. It's okay. Everyone's clouds are ugly the first time. Draw more, and they'll get pretty. Talia stood in the kitchen doorway, her back against the frame, her arms folded across her chest. She watched the scene in front of her without saying anything. Paxton Caldwell, the man no one on the entire East Coast of America dared look straight in the eye, was sitting on the floor of a studio apartment in Brooklyn, holding a light blue crayon, drawing clouds under the instruction of a 6-year-old child. And that child was laughing because his cloud was ugly. Josie kept drawing. She drew quickly, confidently, without erasing. A tall building rising in the middle of the page, many floors, many windows. At the very top, in the window on the highest floor, she drew a man in black standing and looking out. Beside the man, she added a woman with long hair, standing close next to him, the two of them separated by exactly one stroke of the crayon. Josie looked at the picture, tilted her head, then added a big sun in the upper corner. The sun looked exactly like the sun in the drawing taped beside the refrigerator, the one she had drawn of the two sisters holding hands. But today's picture was different. Today's picture had one more person in it. Josie set the crayon down and looked up at Talia. Sissy, what is it? Does the uncle with the sad eyes have a friend now? The apartment fell silent. The sounds of traffic on the Brooklyn street drifted in through the slightly open window, distant and small. Talia looked at the drawing on the floor, the tall building, the window on the top floor, the uncle in black, Sister Talia, the sun. Then she looked at Paxton, sitting on the floor, still holding the light blue crayon, his eyes fixed on the picture Josie had just drawn. For the first time, he didn't look like the man from the dark alley that night. He didn't look like the boss from the 47th floor. Didn't look like Paxton Caldwell, the man the whole city feared. He looked like someone sitting exactly where he was supposed to sit, beside exactly the person he was supposed to be beside, in a small apartment that, for the first time, felt just right. Talia smiled. He does. Josie grinned, turned to Paxton, and clapped her hands. Then you have a friend now. I'm happy for you. Paxton looked at Josie, then looked at Talia. He didn't say anything, but the crayon in his hand still hadn't been set down. And for the first time in many years, the eyes Josie called sad eyes no longer looked sad. Some people carry darkness on their shoulders, yet still choose to step toward the light because they meet the right person. The strongest person isn't the one who holds power, but the one who keeps kindness after losing everything. And sometimes, a box of crayons and an innocent question from a 6-year-old child can heal a wound that an entire empire never could. A person's worth doesn't lie in a title, doesn't lie in money, doesn't lie in social position. It lies in how you treat those weaker than you, in how you choose to stand up and protect someone without needing them to ask, in how you give without demanding anything in return. Talia had nothing but her self-respect and her love for her little sister, but she was richer than many people. And Paxton had everything, yet lacked the one thing money couldn't buy, until a girl who mopped floors placed a food container in front of him at midnight. If this story touched your heart, please press like to support us and share the video with the people you love. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel to hear more beautiful stories every day. How do you feel about this story? Please write your thoughts in the comment section below. We always want to listen to the sharing that comes from deep within your hearts. We wish everyone watching this video very good health, a joyful life, and peaceful days. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.